Welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter, and we are in this video doing part 2 of our introduction to R.A. Lafferty's 1968 novel, Past Master.
Embryonic Arctic, webbings torn, some black galactic fingers born. When will all the star children start?
We looked at 3 blurbs from the time of its publication in the previous video, and now we're going to look at 3 reviews that are roughly of the era, late 1960s, but into the 70s as well. And we're going to begin with actually another blurb from Judith Merril. We'll look at her review in just a second, but I had forgotten about this blurb as well that used to get put on some of the books. And she says, "It is a minor miracle that a serious philosophical and speculative work should be written so colorfully and so lyrically. There is, happily, no way to categorize the book. It has elements of science fiction, of pure fantasy, of poetry, of historical fiction. It is sharply critical and marvelously gentle, very serious and irrepressibly funny, profoundly symbolic and gutsy realistic by unexpected turns. A first-rate speculative work." So that's, Merrill's praise, and again it points to the fact that this is actually a work of philosophy and speculation put in some of the most kind of wild and colorful form or mode that we're likely to see, and we'll get into more of that. But in her review in the May 1968 volume of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, she notes that it's the beginning of a new series from Ace Publishers, the Ace Specials series. I didn't realize Lafferty's was the first book in that series. And she says that it could be considered a valid successor to Miller's classic novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz, or as she puts it more pithily in her anthology SF-12, Past Master is the most readably provocative SF since A Canticle for Leibowitz. But she says here in this review that Past Master is going to be a hard act for Ace to follow. So she goes on to say, "You could describe it as a novel about Thomas More in Utopia, but that would be a laughably simplistic description of a complex, subtle, colorful, and highly sophisticated book, which manages to touch on a wide range of marvelous, mystical, and maniacal phenomena. Page for page, it jams in a host of incident and imagery." I had for a long time been making my complaint about that simplistic plot synopsis of Thomas More and Utopia and all that when I ran across this more recently. And I was pleased to see that she agrees with me. That it's just laughable to say this book is about how we bring Thomas More from the past to critique his own idea of utopia. And not only is there just so much more going on in terms of sheer incident, and flavor and texture, it also is the idea or ideas in this novel are a lot more subtle and complex than that. And she had begun this column of book reviews with a couple of other books that she compares Past Master to favorably. And those are Miguel Asturias' book Mulata and to me, more famous book, Margarita and the Master by Mikhail Bulgakov. She says, among the topics here are hell and the nature of devils and of the devil, politics, affluence and poverty, psyche and psychology, magic, theology, technology, cosmology, and the human condition. So Lafferty covers a lot in this novel, but she's saying that those other novels also did that kind of range and those particular types of topics, and so it's quite an interesting comparison in that way. I do think that some of these things are maybe more lightly touched on, all quite significantly, but some, I won't say any of these themes are like just texture or flavor, but they amount to some texture and flavor because they're not delved into as deeply. So the ones I would have thought were the deepest and most central in the novel previously would have been probably politics and theology. The more I read it, though, while those remain somewhere there in the center, it almost seems to go deeper in terms of psychology and, very much to my surprise, technology. Not only is he doing, vaguely Jungian type stuff in here. I mean, I don't think he fully agreed with Jung, but he's doing like depth psychology type symbolism in here. But he also is beginning to say some really profound things about technology, particularly, I think, about AI. And he will delve into this much more deeply and more complexly in Arrive at Easter Wine. But he's putting some of the seeds of that even in here. And when you see the technology stuff mentioned in book reviews online and stuff like contemporary stuff, it's kind of like, Lafferty was worried that, technology is stealing our souls, so to speak, a very going concern for a lot of people right now. And Lafferty was anticipating that back in 1968. But his view of technology here and in all his work is genuinely ambivalent. It's not some just oversimplified negative sort of view. He sees great potential in technology, including in AI. And here it does come across mostly negative, but if you pay attention, not completely. And then he'll develop that the possible positive side of AI much more in Arrive at Easter Wine. And I used to think these were the light things in Lafferty's, in these two novels in particular, that he was just using AI as a trope, as he does with, say, time travel here. I don't think he's doing anything at all deep about time travel here. It's just a quick mechanism for a certain part of the novel. And so, or even like deep space travel or hyperspace travel. Here, I think he's touched upon something much more profound and absolutely fascinating, but he is being a little more surfacely playful with it. I mean, it connects to the depth psychology stuff massively, so it's part of that. But the sheer actual things happening in hyperspace is mostly for fun. Whereas the technology stuff, and particularly AI, intelligent robots, sentience in machines, he's getting to some of his deepest stuff he wants to say in this novel, and he's allowing it to kind of well up from his own depths of psychology to a degree that I think he infuses it with ambivalences that I'm not sure he was entirely conscious of as, a writer. So anyway, when you see someone like Merrill sort of list out that Lafferty's engaging all these things in this novel, he genuinely is. There's a lot going on here to varying degrees of depth and centrality. And then she too, like Delaney and others, goes into a list, just trying to it's as good a way to approach this novel as any. Just list the contents, see if you can build a little bit of a map out of it, and I think it's the fun and good type of reader participation that is required for this novel. Not a chore to me, not just trying too hard or, in any way off-putting. I think it's there's so much, it gives so much. It's for some of us anyway, such a joy just to let these images fizz in your mind and enjoy the crazy ride that it is. But that to go at it with deeper reflection and take some time and have to kind of piece some things together is a enjoyable task on a different level than, and these things feed back into each other. So she says, in addition to Thomas More, the characters include the child witch Evita, who is 200 years old, Rimrock the Ansel, A-N-S-E-L, a telepathic mutant sea creature, Paul, the outlaw astronaut, Father Adopter of the Green Robes, a monk whose duty is to kill the devil every day, King Charles the 612th of the Faroe Lands, some programmed people of Astrobe, the Lungers of Cathead, some killer machines, Walter Copperhead the Necromancer, and the rulers of Astrobe headed by a triumvirate. And interestingly enough, the novel itself will list a lot of these characters again and again. Certain ones of them form a retinue around Thomas More that travels with him as he explores the planet in both its horrors and wonders. And they get listed a lot. Lafferty loves to do that, but it's a way of reinforcing this little cast of characters with slight variations on their description to fill them out a little more. And I think it's always this really cool little grouping description. And in the same way, I've seen people draw the kind of little retinue around Severian in Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. And it's I saw one person do it in an Adventure Time style. You could totally do that with this novel with Thomas More and Ansel the Rimrock, and there's a couple of sort of androids or whatever with them, and other characters, Paul the astronaut and different stuff, and this strange character Evita. And you could draw this really cool little Adventure Time style grouping of them, as they travel the planet Astrobe. And so she tries to say a little something of how this novel hits her, and she says, Lafferty magics me with humor, anger, and love, and with unpredictable corner-of-the-eye perspectives and perceptions, but above all, I suspect, with his word music, a hyphenated phrase she uses. A couple of great wordings here, which she says, Lafferty magics me, and uses that as a verb, magic, and that's such a great way to talk about it. You know, and there is this scope of humor and anger and love, and despite how cranky Lafferty can be, and he's, you know, calls himself the cranky old man from Tulsa, I think it really does come from a place mostly and ultimately of compassion, and there is a lot of love in his works, in his strange way, and in this novel. And I think it's like hit or miss with a lot of readers as to whether you get magicked by his word music, you know, because that's something you'll hear about him a lot, that he's lyrical and all these different things. And I think he's absolute word music, some of the best I've ever heard. I just think he's very, very uneven about it. I mean, some whole novels like The Devil's Dead or even Fourth Mansions, and many complete short stories will have that word music from beginning to end, and it just is lyrically moving on really nicely. And a lot of other stuff will kind of bounce in and out. And this is one of the most choppy in that regard. We've already talked in the last video about this being a choppy novel at the plot level and maybe some other things, pacing and stuff. And we'll see some more about that in a minute. But also in terms of the lyrical writing, you know, sometimes it'll just go dead prosaic and then bounce into like really great lyricism. And sometimes he does this strange thing with syntax all around in many different ways. But in this particular way, in that a sentence can begin lyrical and end prosaic, or vice versa, or something in the middle there is happening. And you kind of even feel the sentence itself stop-start in sound and rhythm and etc., which is not all bad. It often is something of a flaw. Sometimes I think it's something very intricate he's doing with syntax on purpose. Sometimes I think it's just the way it comes out. But regardless, it makes for this just, and this is what you'll hear about Lafferty a lot as well. Even when it's not all coming together just right, it just makes for this super interesting approach to the English language that just seems to take nothing for granted and is always kind of pulling you up, sometimes in delightful ways and sometimes less so. But always like going, whoa, I'm seeing the English language fresh here. So it's really cool in that way. There is a word music, even if it's sometimes a slapdash word music. It's still music. And then she concludes this way. So interesting. She says, and yet, dash, yet. Okay, she says, and yet there is something missing here, something a little bit less than complete. I do not think it is simply a lack of my own kind of logic. I do not have to agree with Lafferty's manner of reasoning to be both enchanted and, can I say, ideated by it. Okay, she's just great with the way she uses language herself to talk about these things. But here, at this point, she just changes the subject and moves on to her next book review and never comes back to this. So it's like, whoa. So she just ends with this note of, and yet, you know, and that's very much how I've always felt about the novel, you know, and what is this missing element, or what is incomplete about the novel? And she eliminates one thing. She says, it's not just like that he approaches logic. Notice she doesn't say he's illogical, but that he approaches logic in a way that she wouldn't per se, reasoning in a way that she might not. She's like, that doesn't matter. I can still be enchanted by it. Or like she says, ideated by it. I mean, like, what does that mean for a person to be ideated by an object, by a novel? You know, it turns you into an idea. I don't even understand that, but I love it. And it definitely speaks to this being a novel of ideas, and one that is impactful, one that through its strange reasoning and so on will get into you and into your psyche in unusual, unconventional ways. But she says, so the missing element isn't that. But I do think it speaks to what many readers and reviewers have felt. Like, this is magic, this is amazing, I'm so blown away by this, but, you know, and that's something you get from reading Lafferty a lot anyway. But particularly this novel, I think, it hits you more that way. Sometimes you think there's more going on than you can grasp and that kind of thing, but not necessarily in a way that you would go, and yet. You would just go, oh, it was so great, and there's more going on than I can grasp right now. Whereas in this one, you do have a sort of falter to your reading, or for many of us, where you go, I'm just not totally sure. And of course, there's also the possibility that less than complete quality to it is part of Lafferty's project here. And as he does with most of his fiction, and the scholar Andrew Ferguson is the main sort of proponent of this idea that he's working in a mode that leaves things unfinished and requires the readers to participate in finishing that work. And that there is a formal element of that going on in this novel, especially in its last pages. But also I think, that there's potentially these sort of apertures and the brokenness to the novel, the incompleteness to it is all throughout, and it is an opening out onto other things and making thinking and reasoning about psychology and politics and everything else kind of move in this, metatextual sort of direction. And in fact, it fits the theme in that, the utopia is allegedly perfect. And the response to that perfection is to go, and yet. And so it's kind of appropriate that this isn't a perfect novel, that it doesn't just sew up this beautiful, perfect critique of utopianism. It itself is incomplete and speaks to what it's trying to champion, that there's always a surplus, always an excess, there's always something more. It uses the phrase things beyond. And you can read that in the religious sense that I'm sure Lafferty means it, but I also think he means it in just many, many other ways, that there's always things beyond in this life, in all of us, in everything. And that if you ever try to ensure that there are no things beyond, there's no excess, there's no surplus, ontologically speaking or culturally or whatever, then you're probably in the territory of dystopia. So let's move on to another critic's review here, Sheryl Smith. Now, she does a really intense critical review of his book, Arrive at Easter Wine. And here, this is more of just a fan review, sort of for fun type take on Past Master, because it was republished at this time in the 70s. And so she starts out just being cute and funny, going, "Let there be whoopee and rejoicing in the streets, and maybe even a little cackling on public transport. For R.A. Lafferty's Past Master is back in print in an American hardcover edition." And she talks about how this is just in time because she has multiple copies and they're wearing out, and she's giving them away and proselytizing, her word, for Lafferty. And that is not the first time I've heard reviewers and editors and stuff and fans just talk about this, like handing out his works or leaving his works out in waiting rooms and subways and stuff. And she talks about that too. People, he just often, creates that kind of reaction in his readers. He has a cult following. But then she goes on to say some really meaty stuff about Lafferty. She says, "Lafferty at his best is a metaphysical humorist who has taken the tall tale and given it Jungian ramifications." And that is just a great way to sum up a lot of what Lafferty is doing. And as I've said before, I don't consider him a humorist or a humor writer, or that his works are humor writing. Certainly not comedy writing in the sort of basic sense of comedy that we would think of it now, not in the big categories of like comedy and tragedy. We'll see more about that in a minute. But I think she's getting at what Delaney was saying with profound wit, that if he is a humorist, he's a metaphysical humorist. So it's sort of humor writing that is getting at ontology, at reality, at metaphysics. And then he's working in this tall tale mode, but infusing it with like deep psychological sort of categories or ideas. And I'm not going to get into these people right now, but there's some critics and stuff who have looked at Past Master from an archetypal and Jungian sort of perspective. And we will touch on that later. So Sheryl Smith's not the first to think that. She goes on to say, "Past Master is the first of 3 fine and original novels, Fourth Mansions and Arrive at Easter Wine are the others, in which Lafferty takes the mythological world ending, previously the domain of tragedy, and contrives to do it comedically with no loss of scope. This comes out as a sort of psychocosmic gaming in the mystical sense," she says. And in her review of Arrive at Easter Wine, she goes more into this world-ending aspect, and she says that these 3 novels are end-of-the-world comedies. That's her phrase for them. So Past Master is an end-of-the-world comedy, which for her is like kind of an oxymoron or a paradox, because she considers tragedies to be the proper form of like apocalypse or world ending. And I actually was looking up a little bit about this because I don't know a lot about tragedies and had never heard that kind of idea. But yeah, apparently I didn't even know that some of the big tragedies like Hamlet or whatever have a kind of an apocalyptic element to them, or Oedipus Rex and these things. And so for Lafferty to sort of transpose that theme or matter over into the form or mode of comedy, and this is the bigger sense of comedy, where things arc instead of towards tragedy, toward, joy or some kind of quote unquote happy resolution, but in a deep sense, in sort of an Aristotelian type sense. And I've seen some letters that Sheryl and Lafferty sort of wrote back and forth to each other when I visited the archive. And it's a nice little exchange, and she's trying to get him to read and critique a tragic play that she wrote. And I remember I remember them kind of going back and forth and not connecting on it. That's all exactly I remember about it. But I like this idea of it being a psychocosmic gaming, and I understand the psychocosmic part. Is, as I've said, it's very much this depth psychology thing, but it's about the inner and the outer. It's about the inner cosmos and the cosmos in which we find ourselves. But in what sense it's gaming, especially mystical gaming, I'm just going to have to keep my eye on. And if you have an idea about that, please share. So she goes on to do some of the basic outlining that most people do about they brought Thomas More forward to critique and or save this utopia, that they've built around his idea. And of course he's like, why did you take my sick joke as a real blueprint for society? And notes the repressive elements of this utopia, whilst it is genuinely a social experiment that has brought about great plenty. There's no need or want. If you don't think right in this utopia and support it on that level, there are mechanical killers that will come after you. But she notes that in Thomas More going around and exploring sort of these polarities between the utopian cities and these slum cities and stuff, she says that the central part of his search concerns the feral strips. His journey through these with an assorted entourage constitutes a romp through the unconscious of a world. It is replete with mythological hijinks. Thomas and company help one father adopter kill the devil. We must kill him every day to limit his limits. Visit the Salic Emperor, an office created and maintained by a dissident college fraternity. Charles the 612th at his very small imperial capital, and have a hairbreadth escape from mechanical killers on Electric Mountain. So again, she resorts to listing, as we all do with Lafferty and with this novel in particular. And again, I think partly because it's fun. It's like you want people to know there's some crazy stuff going on in here. But I loved that she focused on the feral strips. That has always been the most exciting and more the most important part of the novel to me, doing some of its central work when they go for a few chapters into these feral regions, as they're called. And so we'll eventually get into that. But that, my interest is piqued, not least because that's where the main monsters are. But there's a lot going on there that's really cool, and it gets really tall and salty in that part, in a novel that is already filled with things tall and salty. But she's right that it's a romp through the unconscious of this world. She goes on to talk about how Thomas begins to have, because at first he really embraces the utopia and then he begins to have doubts about it. And she says that during this time he has a secret meeting with 9 preeminent programmed persons, androids, a minority group. A confrontation he is made to forget. It turns out that these programmed ones are worshippers of personified nothingness, whose ultimate goal is to, quote, close down the worlds and make an end to life, end quote. They offer Thomas various advantages if he will throw in with them, but he does not accept. And she's describing this particular chapter late on in the novel that in my more recent reads, I have been really blown away by and has become one of my favorite chapters. It is very, very strange. Again, in a novel that is already filled with the strange. And they sort of, in their phrasing, they show him the backside of the tapestry, and this becomes an important image. But she's also touching on this aspect of the novel where there's this entity called Udin the nothingness monster, as he's called in the novel. And that, yes, certain of the programmed people worship this nothingness and have the goal of sort of making nothingness supreme. And well, we'll talk more about it, but it is surprisingly effective in sort of engaging certain iterations of nihilism. And, as with like the mechanical killers and this like personified nothingness, it's all so over the top. And it works almost like this like cartoonish allegory, but that is so cartoonish and over the top that it somehow pushes through and works. Like where you think it might be like, okay, this is making straw men and all kinds of things, it has a certain like power and sustain to it that really gets you thinking, and then you realize, yeah, this is kind of a pantomime, a cartoon, but one that is freaky and trippy, and through that kind of gets you to think about its overblown sort of allegorical tokens or whatever. At least that's my view of it. So she says that when Thomas is, if this can be spoiled, this is a spoiler, but this is mainly for people who've already read it, that once Thomas has been beheaded, then this sort of death of the universe happens. And she says the novel ends, leaving us hopefully suspended in a timeless, in-between moment awaiting the new universe. Science fiction, goes the saw, is a literature of ideas, and Lafferty's are among the weirdest and best. His ideas, however, pertain to psychological happenstance rather than social or scientific, which causes them to be unduly overlooked. There are a number of fertile concepts in Past Master. Some are incidental, like this one about hyperspace travel. Quote, "The law of conservation of psychic totality will not be abridged. There were 4.5 years of psychic awareness to be compressed into 1 month, and it forced its compression into these intense and rapid dreams." And she cites the hyperspace dreams as a sort of more incidental idea in this book, and then the whole like death of the universe scene to be one of the bigger, she says it's the dazzler of the book. And then she says, but nearly all the ideas in Past Master are arresting. And then she concludes, now I have to put down this reminder that Past Master is a very funny book. The meaningfulness is extra. And I think that's a, playful, paradoxical thing to say. But I think she's right. Obviously, it is very funny, or a lot of it is. And whilst Lafferty is trying to get at some meaningfulness on purpose from beginning to end, and has worked a lot of that carefully into it, there is also a sense in which the meaningfulness is extra, and that, again, is the point of this book, both in form and content, that there is always something extra. There is excess, there is surplus. And it's important that things be extra, be surplus, that you can't necessarily put a use value on things, etc. And so whilst I'm talking a lot about the possible meanings and sort of philosophical depths and things of this novel, I don't mean to say that this is some kind of academic assignment that Lafferty has given us here. It is fun and funny and thrilling. There are parts that slightly drag for me, and always have, though those become less and less every time I read. But overall, this is as the blurbs in the previous episode noted, this is a high adventure, and there's lots of action in it and these sorts of things, and just weird imagery and stuff. So it's a fun, wild book that also happens to be overflowing with meaning. So lastly, we'll look at another review from the mid-70s by Fred Chappell. It was collected in a little one-issue fanzine called At the Sleepy Sailor, which is from Lafferty's novel that also came out in this year, Space Shanty, but it's also from Past Master, because there's a chapter in here called At the Naked Sailor. And these are the name of various pubs, Naked Sailor, Sleepy Sailor, etc. Right? His review is titled Lafferty's First Best Novel, or Past Master Passes Muster. And so I'm just going to read out his opening chunk here, because it all kind of flows and makes one point. It would be hard for a critic, and I'm no critic, to decide whether R.A. Lafferty's Past Master is a good novel or a bad one. There is a way in which this common, all too common, judgment has little relevance. It is not hard to find faults with the book. The pace is uneven, stopping dead still at times, and at other times whooshing down like a tumbling chimney. The characters are rarely fully drawn, motivation is often murky, and the storyline never quite makes sense, etc., etc., etc. These faults would be enough to sink most novels, and Lord knows they have indeed sunk many a well-intentioned SF novel. But with all these faults and others, Past Master never goes under. It succeeds in the way that it succeeds because it is daring, Let's face it, with all the hype about adventurous ideas and bold new concepts and so forth, most SF novels are essentially timid. Most SF novels are built upon notions and not ideas, and at those points where notions may actually develop into ideas, the writer is likely to pull back and give us mindless action instead of following his thought. I observe this habit even in Bester and Heinlein. When he does present his notions more thoroughly, the SF writer is wont to present them rather joylessly, eschewing the advantages of prose style, metaphor, perspective, and humor. Past Master is not nerveless, whatever it is. Neither is it really a novel of ideas. It is a headlong melee of fancies, loosely tied to a couple of central notions. There is a streak of bizarre humor in it, an intermittent wordplay, and a current of crazy poetry that never gets securely directed. In many books, these qualities might be faults. In Lafferty's, they are strengths. Now let's just pick this apart a little bit. I don't know how whether the novel is good or bad has little relevance here, unless he just means that you can't judge this novel as to whether it's good or bad because it's not really a novel or it's something other or more or hybrid. But I do heartily agree with him that the uneven pacing has always been one of my complaints about this book. And here I will say, and I meant to say this from the beginning, I have to say, up until recently, this has always been, I don't know if to say one of my least favorite Lafferty novels, but it's been way down on the list for me. Now, it has always contained some of my all-time favorite moments and elements that you can find anywhere in Lafferty. So I've, over the years I had gone back and read certain passages over and over and over again and like quoted them and things like that. But as an overall novel, it just never, grabbed me as much as so many of the other ones do and did. And pacing was a big part of that. I feel that it gets stopped up in sort of conversations between characters where it's like just barreling along in all this high adventure or strange imagery and stuff, and then comes to these stops. That said, in all honesty, I've been very surprised to find how I knew its estimation would go up with rereads because that always happens with Lafferty's works, at least in certain respects. But I've been surprised how much it just keeps rising and rising, becoming more coherent. And I still think that pacing is an issue to a degree, but I'm now realizing, there's so much more going on in those long conversations than I had ever realized. And they're way more vibrant and colorful than I had quite remembered. And they're punctuated with really cool things. And it's, they work way better than I had realized before. But I'll have to keep an eye out for some of these things he says as we go through this read. Not sure about motivation being murky. I might agree with that. And that the storyline never quite makes sense. I doubt I will agree with. And it's probably something I kind of thought in the past as well, but just things about this novel tie together more and more every time I read it. But to the degree that we find these things to be flaws or faults, I agree with him that whereas that would sink a lot of novels, Past Master stays afloat. It never goes under. It's daring, it's not timid in putting out these ideas or notions. I can't really agree with him that it is not ultimately a novel of ideas, and that was something that Matt from Bookpilled said that at the time when he read it a little while ago now, he had said that it was more a novel of ideas than he had yet encountered in SF. And that's saying a lot because he had read a lot of big idea novels by that point. I don't know if he'd still say that, but it's significant. In fact, I'd probably just rephrase Chappelle here and say that Past Master is a headlong melee of fancies, loosely but meaningfully tied to a couple central ideas. So I agree that it's, this headlong melee of fancies. It has that quality to it for sure. But these are tied to not just notions, but some deep ideas in there. And whilst I think it is loose in a lot of ways, the way the fancies tie to the deep ideas, it's strong, it's meaningful. But I think I agree, especially about the intermittent wordplay and quote-unquote crazy undirected poetry. That I think that's another thing readers get confused about. They're as I've mentioned already, that they're with the word music thing from Judith Merril, that aspect of things can also seem to be stop-start, the way the plot or the narrative pacing is. Again, particularly in this novel and less so in most of the other novels, I would say. And I have seen reviewers say that this suffers from, what most first novels suffer from, and that may very well be so, which makes it all the more surprising how sturdy and durable this novel is, and it's continuing to have an impact. And I've mentioned that like The Devil is Dead and Fourth Mansions, for example, are more consistent in terms of their word music and their sort of literary quality right from beginning to end. But even novels that came out in this year, Space Shanty and Reefs of Earth, have a sort of an undirected poetry, as he says, to them, but the poetic language and so on itself is not really intermittent. It's continuous. It's just a little kind of careening off in various directions. I mean, I think those novels still cohere, but like Past Master, they're a little unwieldy, but in a way that's not as inconsistent, I think, as Past Master is. But interestingly, Past Master is probably far more a novel of ideas than those. So, there's a lot of give and take with Lafferty. If you get one thing, it's at the cost of another, etc. But usually the things you get are well worth the cost, at least in my experience. So this novel of ideas is worth some of that stop-start quality, both in prose style and pacing or plotting. Now here Chappelle goes and does what everybody does, the outline of the Thomas More Utopia plot. And he says of that, he says, now that's a fair thought, this idea of bringing Thomas More forward to critique his own utopia in the future. That's a fair thought, and I can't help wishing that Lafferty had gone on to treat it more directly, with a kind of dialogue of the dead between More's two selves from the past and now. But I, for one, I like what Lafferty did better. I'd rather see what he did and just kind of making More his own creation and having this whole... It is a novel of philosophical dialogue, not unlike like Plato's Republic or maybe the works of Hume or Nietzsche, for that matter. It has that quality to it, but mixed with all this wild adventure, almost like what little I know of like Ovid's Metamorphoses or something, that kind of constantly shifting and multiple perspectives and things going on. And in saying that he wished Lafferty had gone a little more into that official sort of More, critiquing More, as it were. He notes that some might object that SF isn't supposed to be about like criticism. And he's like, well, no, I think that's exactly what SF is supposed to be about. And he says when SF books are not about criticism, those books become a species of Saturday morning TV. Now, what I think is amazing about this book is that Lafferty has almost taken that form of Saturday morning TV, of cartoons and so on. And Eric Walker talks about the connections between Lafferty and animated cartoons, and I think he's spot on. But with all this sort of like over-the-top like hyper allegory or hyper metaphor that Lafferty uses in here, it is cartoonish, as I've said, but manages to do a genuine criticism of utopia through that strange and funny form. Chappelle goes on, the utopian astrobe is a sister Earth tied to its faraway older sibling by a kind of interstellar dream subway. That is brilliant for Lafferty's little vision of hyperspace, or he calls it hop equation space. And I'm going to try to use that from now on, this like interstellar dream subway. And after talking a bit more about the plot and structure of the book and how there's more than just the utopian cities, there's the slum cities and there's this whole feral region. Again, a mention of that, which is always good in a review. He makes this a comment: as a consistent literary construction, Past Master fails completely. Lafferty poses a tough ethical problem, which he then surrounds with impenetrable political intrigue, sociological speculation, exciting odysseys, and nightmare biologies, all of which are irrelevant to the problem. His resolution, which suddenly becomes an abstruse speculation on the nature of time, does not leave his narrative hanging, but neither does it truly resolve it. And I think I would say that Past Master doesn't fail completely, it fails partially as a consistent literary construction. Or we may see that failure actually amounts to the invention of a new kind of literary construction. But it still probably has flaws. But I just don't understand what he's saying about some of these things being impenetrable or irrelevant. I just don't think that. I think it does all tie together whilst also trying to careen off and veer off at the same time. Anyway, he goes on. But again, I'm not sure that consistent construction is importantly at stake here. When I think of Past Master from a kind of mind's eye distance, I do not think of it in terms of cleanly made SF novels like Starship Troopers, or even in terms of a mystical SF novel like Childhood's End. To me, it seems to lie almost within the tradition of the perfervid, illogical romantic poems like Shelley's Prometheus Unbound or Leon and Cintha, or in the tradition of the early Gothic novel like Vathek, which is to say that its narrative progression is not likely to be controlled by internal logic, but by the writer's obsessions, fancies, dreams, and impulses. The writer feels that he has something important to say, and he dresses it out in splendid and exotic images. Or conversely, he is haunted by burning but ill-defined shapes in his imagination, and he must give them voice, whatever they mean, and maybe even if they have no definable meaning. In this book, Lafferty has a vision, and Pastmaster fails as a novel the more it tries to become a novel, the more it tries to keep that vision curbed. That word, novel, predicates a kind of discipline to which Lafferty's vision is radically opposed. It is for this reason that I believe that Pastmaster should be much longer than it is, that it should explain less, for finally it explains nothing at all, and exhibit more. That it should move more, be even freer in time and space and language. And then he goes on to speculate that he thinks the reason it's not those things is because of an editor's hand. When in fact, if you read Andrew Ferguson's Intro to the Library of America edition, the editor really helped him actually move more than he was. But let's talk about this interesting claim that he's making here. This whole like romantic Gothic association that he puts the novel into is fascinating to me, and I want to think more about that. And I think he's definitely right to a degree. I mean, that first paragraph, I could almost just say, yeah, I agree with that. But it still makes me want to talk about it more and maybe make a qualification. I think what he's essentially describing is, again, what I called in the last episode, Lafferty's dream punk mode that is very much at play here in this novel. You know, and you could say the Romantics were the first dream punks. But again, as I've noticed upon every reread of this novel, Lafferty does go to some trouble to sort of weave these exotic images and ill-defined shapes that are like burning and need to come out into something of a thematic and narrative coherence. And again, he's saying the same thing that Delaney said, that this is a vision here. We have a vision. This is a form of vision literature, and that's, again, how it exceeds the form of the novel. There is a sense in which I would like the novel to move more, and possibly explain less, but I don't think it needs to exhibit more. It's exhibited plenty. But yeah, I understand his feelings there. And he points out at this point that Thomas More isn't exactly the 16th century historical person, but Lafferty's own sort of invention. And it's possibly Lafferty's very best character that he ever drew at length and depth. He's really, really good, Thomas More. But as Chappelle notes of Lafferty's Thomas More, often he is acerbic, more a pissed mister than a past master. And that's very true. And he talks a little more about sort of the plot mechanics of More and the purpose he serves in the book. And then he says, I have concentrated too thoroughly on the main strands of Lafferty's book and have not allowed myself space to celebrate its ornamentation. It is filled with puns, proverbs, jokes, anecdotes, fables, witty retorts, and neat formulations. Maybe none of them is smoothly introduced, but they are all there to startle and delight. He loves to invent animals too, ansels, Lazarus lions, hydras, Portia's panthers, brain snakes. One longish passage in the book is a Weinbaumian odyssey, and he is very good with dreams and with distorted memories. Pastmaster is finally a big, shiny, delirious clutter of impulse. Anywhere you poke into it, you will find something bright and interesting. If you try to put it all together, you will lose more than you are able to keep. It's a glorious mess, and I, for one, am willing to put up with the mess for the sake of the glory. And that's exactly, I don't want to make that mistake. I want to, as we go through this, we're going to look at all those little things, and we're going to focus on this quote-unquote ornamentation. And again, my thesis is you will not lose more than you're able to keep if you try to put these pieces together. Quite the reverse. I mean, the novel is, to a significant degree, a big, shiny, delirious clutter of impulse. But it's one that those impulses have been shaped and collaged into a whole. And it is an admittedly unwieldy whole. It's a glorious mess to a degree. And I think that's part of its joys, but it is still managing to say something at a larger, coherent scale. So that's the 3 reviews. Two last things here in this part of the introduction before we go in the next video through a very brief sort of chapter by chapter synopsis of it so that we can get into some of these details in an overview sort of way. I want to note that I only recently found in the past couple of years that Samuel Delany said something very, very interesting about Past Master in an interview, which I'll link to. Delany says, "I've always seen SF thinking as fundamentally different from utopian thinking. I feel that to force SF into utopian templates is a largely unproductive strategy. I think that possibility is what Le Guin is raising by calling the dispossessed an ambiguous utopia." That's her subtitle for it. Delany goes on, "It's only by problematizing the utopian notion, by rendering its hard parameters somehow permeable, even undecidable, that you can make it yield anything interesting. R.A. Lafferty began the process with his satirical reading of Thomas More in Past Master. Ursula and I shared a publisher with him, and we were both sent readers' galleys. In our turns, we simply followed suit." Wow. So according to Delany, Le Guin and he picked up where Lafferty left off, or picked up the baton from Lafferty and said, okay, we'll make a go of this too. I think that is fascinating. I have no idea if Le Guin would agree with that. So we'll definitely eventually have a conversation comparing those 3 novels. Le Guin's Dispossessed was subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia, and Delany's Triton was subtitled A Heterotopia. And I like to have fun thinking of what could we give as a subtitle to Lafferty's Past Master. Obviously you could say an anti-utopia. But that's still too hard-edged. It doesn't signify that permeability that Delany is talking about here, which I think this novel very much has that permeability. So I would like to call it Past Master an Amphibious Utopia, which is obviously riffing on the ambiguity aspect, because, you know, it is actually describing a utopia, a good place, no place, which is the original pun of the term. But it quite literally goes in and out of planetary waters and land, but also in and out of the waters of unconsciousness and, if you like, the dry land of culture. So it has that amphibious quality about it, sort of psychologically and ontologically and these sorts of things. And as such, problematizes utopia in really, really, really interesting ways, not just a like utopia bad, you know, type of critique. And lastly, I'll just mention there's a blog called Porcius Fiction Log that I'll link to that does lots of great little reviews of old SF, of vintage SF. And it's done quite a few favorable reviews of Lafferty that he only discovered more recently or began to read at any length more recently. By recently, I guess I'd say maybe the last 5 years or so. But his review of Past Master is probably the best I've seen for giving a very coherent outline or synopsis of the novel in terms of its plot and narrative movement and in terms of at least some of its themes. Now, like all such things, for me, it's too reductive. It doesn't give enough of all this bristly wildness and whatever that I've been trying to point out through these blurbs and reviews. But nevertheless, if you want to like wrap your head around like what did I just read, or maybe what I'm about to read, I think that's one of the best ones I've seen. So thanks again for tuning in, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the chapters next. And as I said last time, do look out for some news about Patreon and Substack. Thanks. Take care.